Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Mac, and today we're talking about Elemental Shaman Cooldown usage. I've been seeing a lot of questions recently about Stormkeeper, mainly because of how our tier set interacts with it. Normally, the general rule of thumb with cooldowns is pretty simple. If you can stack your cooldowns together, you should stack them together. But with Stormkeeper and Ascendance, the timings are kind of weird. They naturally desync, and that's where a lot of confusion seems to be coming from. So the big question here is, does the normal rule still apply here, or is Stormkeeper one of those situations where you actually just want to send it on cooldown without worrying about syncing it up? And the short answer to that is always dependent upon the situation, but like 95% of the time, whether or not you're in Raid or Mythic Plus, the answer is just going to be send Stormkeeper on cooldown. Because at the end of the day, getting more total cast of Stormkeeper is usually way more valuable than trying to force perfect sync with Ascendance and risking missed uses over the course of a fight or a dungeon. So that's what we're going to be breaking down in this video because there's a bit of nuance given the different situations. With our current build, Ascendance is now a 2-minute cooldown and Stormkeeper is a 45-second cooldown. So even if you're playing perfectly, they're still going to naturally desync. On paper, that desync is only about 15 seconds, which initially doesn't sound that bad, but in actual gameplay with mechanics, movement, or whatever else is happening, it usually ends up being somewhere more like 25 to 30 seconds. As a general rule, holding a cooldown for more than about 10 seconds is already pretty bad unless you have a very specific reason for it. And once that hold starts running into 25 or 30 seconds, now you're not really syncing anymore, you're just kind of bleeding casts. And to show you how bad that is, let's get a little bit nerdy here for a second and talk about the math. Stormkeeper is a 45-second cooldown. So if you hold it for 30 seconds just to line it up with Ascendance, that is basically a 66% increase to the cooldown of the cast. You're turning a 45-second cooldown into a minute and 15-second cooldown, and that is a massive loss. If you do that once, whatever, maybe a situation justified it. But if you do it multiple times over the course of a raid, fight, or a dungeon, that adds up really fast. 30 seconds of holding that cast is a total delay of 60 seconds, which is already more than an entire cast of Stormkeeper. If you hold it for 30 seconds 3 times, that is 90 total seconds, which is 2 full casts of Stormkeeper completely lost. And I already hear the next questions. But Mac, what about our tier set? Yes, our tier set absolutely makes Stormkeeper more valuable. Getting that haste buff is good, and getting that haste buff inside Ascendance is obviously even better. So I completely understand why people look at this interaction and assume we should be holding Stormkeeper to pair them each time. The problem is just that the tier set does not change the underlying math we just talked about. It makes syncing them together a more powerful window, but it does not make a 30-second hold suddenly more efficient, and that's the most important distinction here. The question isn't, is Stormkeeper better inside Ascendance? Because of course it is. The question is whether the extra value is enough to justify delaying a 45-second cooldown by 30 seconds, and most of the time it just isn't. The tier set rewards natural overlaps, but it doesn't justify forcing the overlap at the cost of losing total Stormkeeper casts. So yes, when they line up cleanly, that is great and we absolutely take it every time, but the tier set is not a reason to start sitting on Stormkeeper for half its cooldown every single cycle. And honestly, this becomes even easier to justify or quantify when you look at things like trinkets, or more specifically our theoretical best trinket with the Emberwing Feather. This is a 2-minute on-use haste trinket, making it line up perfectly with Ascendance. So if part of your concern is losing that haste value by not always pairing Stormkeeper with Ascendance, that problem is kind of already solved for you with this trinket. Your Ascendance window can still have a clean haste pairing built directly into it through that trinket. And then on top of that, your timings actually kind of start to fix themselves as the fight goes on anyways. Around the 4-minute mark, Stormkeeper starts to naturally line up a lot easier with Ascendance again. So a lot of the value you think you're losing early on by not forcing that sync, you often just get back naturally as the fight goes on. But with all that in mind, let's talk about Raid and Mythic Plus, because while they're similar, they do look a bit different. In Raid, all this cooldown mumbo-jumbo matters the most because fights are long enough that missed Stormkeeper casts really start to add up. That's why in something like a Raid encounter, the answer is almost always going to be send Stormkeeper on cooldown. Realistically, you should expect it to line up with about every other Ascendance, not every single one. Mythic Plus is a little bit different just because the content is way more fluid and loosey-goosey. Pulls are shorter, routes change, mobs die at weird times, and you have a lot more freedom to make judgment calls depending upon what your pack looks like at that given time. So in keys, if you can hold Stormbringer briefly to combine it with Ascendance for a really important pull, that's great. Or if the timings just naturally work out in your favor, that's even better. But even in Mythic Plus, the same core rule still applies. You don't want to be sitting on Stormkeeper just to make every pull perfect, because at the end of the day, it's still more valuable getting as many casts of Stormkeeper out as possible than trying to force it into an Ascendance window cleanly. So Raid is a little bit more rigid and Mythic Plus is a little bit more flexible, but the general answer in both is still basically the same. Now, with all that said, there are situations where holding your cooldowns can make sense. And I'm not just talking about specifically syncing them up, I'm talking about holding your cooldowns. And this is where it becomes a bit more encounter specific. If you have a fight where adds are spawning on a more predictable timer and those adds actually matter, then yeah, maybe holding them briefly for a moment can work out better. A good example of this would be a fight like Imperator. You've got adds coming in at a consistent pace, they're grouped, they're going to live long enough, and you can get some real value out of dumping Ascendance and Stormkeeper together into all that AoE. That is actually one of the few fights where I would consider, and consider being the key word here, holding my CDs more intentionally. But even then, only if timings seem to work out cleanly. But the key thing here is whether that damage actually matters, and that might not make sense, but give me a second. You look at fights like Veilgore and Ezerak and think, okay, the same idea, I should hold my cooldowns for adds. But in reality, those adds die so fast that it's basically just useless pad damage. It looks good on meters, but it's not actually contributing anything meaningful to the fight because, realistically, other classes are going to be able to mow those adds down a lot quicker than you saving your cooldowns for it. So in those situations, you're way better off just sending your cooldowns into the boss and getting as much real damage as possible. And that's kind of where you want to draw the line. If holding your cooldowns can allow you to convert that damage into meaningful damage, then it can be worth it. But if you're just going to be padding on adds that are going to die pretty quickly anyways, then you're usually just hurting your overall value. But to wrap this all up, I just wanted to bring back the main idea. Even though Ascendance and Stormkeeper look like they should always be paired together, in practice they just don't line up cleanly enough for that to be your default mindset. The timings are awkward, the desync is natural, and trying to force that sync actually just ends up costing you more casts over the course of a fight. And at the end of the day, number of casts is what actually matters. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you've been trying to force Stormkeeper and Ascendance together every time, hopefully this clears up why that's been feeling a little bit awkward. And I'd actually be really curious to hear how you've been handling this. Have you been syncing them up or just sending them? Let me know in the comments below. If this helped you out, make sure to like the video. It really does help the channel a ton. And subscribe for more Elemental and general WoW content. Also, I've been streaming over at Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern to my raid time, so if you want to hang out, ask questions, or just watch us raid or do keys, feel free to stop by and say hi. And finally, if you want to support the channel a bit more directly, I've linked my Patreon down below, along with a Discord where you can come talk to others about the spec, questions, or just hang out with the community. But yeah, that's all I got for this one, so thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in the next one.